So I'm going to let Catherine introduce herself, but definitely let us know if you can't hear us or if you have any challenges.
Thanks, Deanna Ogle, campaign organizer for the Living Wage for Families campaign. I'm Catherine Ludgate. I'm the manager of community investment at Van City, and we are a longtime supporter and participant in the Living Wage for Families campaign, as well as being a certified employer. And my portfolio of work includes advocating to other employers to join us in the Living Wage campaign. So I hope to share some experiences today as an employer, the process of joining.
Great. So the goals for today are twofold. So there's kind of two main goals that we have. The first is to provide some concrete skills for approaching employers to discuss the living wage so that we can walk away from this webinar feeling like we're equipped or we know we have a list of what we should be doing before we're approaching a potential living wage employer. The second is to reduce the fear that many of us feel around approaching employers to talk about the living wage. I know that there is some hesitancy or fear, do I know what to say? What are the things I should have on our plate? And that can sometimes freeze us from taking action. So this webinar is to kind of loosen us up a little bit so that we can leap into the fray and to recruit some employers who are favorable to the living wage but may never have been approached. The second piece is the more technical. So for folks who haven't used GoToWebinar before, if you're having trouble with your audio through your computer, you can call in. And so the information there is the call-in information for folks who are having trouble with audio. If you want to ask a question, there is on the lower right-hand corner a chat where you can ask a question. I think there's also a way that you can raise your hand to ask a question, and so if you do that, we will actually let you talk because we'll unmute you. Everyone is muted, so feel free to eat all the carrots you like until we get to a section where maybe you have a specific question. We're going to try to address questions as we go, but we also put a generous amount of time at the end of the webinar for your questions. We know that a lot of us are working in our own specific areas, and you may have very specific questions related to your work. So we have time for that at the end. To be clear that this webinar is not for campaigns. We're not going to cover how to build a campaign to encourage a public sector employer to sign on. We're also assuming that you have some basic understanding of what the living wage is and how it's calculated. So if you have any questions about that, I would encourage you to visit our website at livingwageforfamilies.ca.
Thanks, Deanna. I'm going to talk, it's Catherine, I'm going to talk for a couple of slides now about identifying potential employers. And to draw an analogy, finding an employer that's likely to sign on to the Living Wage campaign, you really need to apply the same kind of discipline and research that you would as if you were trying to find a job. It's about finding the right alignment of interest between the Living Wage for Families campaign and the prospective employer, understanding the particular reasons or motivation that employer would have in joining the campaign, offering information of value to the employer, and then closing solidly with the living wage as a great choice. So if your background is in sales, that will sound like a familiar process. If your background is in fundraising, it's the same. If you've recently been on job search, it's the same kind of approach. And it's also important at the beginning when you're producing your list of suspects or prospects or warm referrals, that you understand the difference between different types of employers. Oh, I will move closer to Deanna, and I will stop waving my arms. Understand the different types of employers, public sector, private sector, and community or not-for-profit sector. And as Deanna alluded to, working with a public sector employer like a crown corporation or a municipality is a complex process involving inside work with the employer and outside work with the community stakeholders. And we're not going to talk a lot about that today, although Deanna could lead a brilliant workshop on that at another time. I want to talk more about reaching to community sector or for-profit employers that actually have a simpler process for making a decision to join you in a living wage campaign. Just be alive to the fact that each of those sectors has its own complexities, and we hope to touch on each of them a bit here today. Okay. We also know that it's important to get some early successes. Success breeds success, as it does in any other kind of work. So in the process of identifying local employers, as I can see Greg is on the phone call and other people from across the country, in the absence at this today of a unified national framework that involves an intake and certification process for employers, there's really no point, frankly, in spending your time working with a large employer that's a national employer or that spans multiple geographies, because that employer will just be frustrated when they realize that there's no single point of intake into the campaign. So focus on employers that are local or provincial, that have their head offices here, that can make decisions here in whatever jurisdiction you're in, whether it's BC or Ontario or Saskatchewan. Look for a local or regional employer. And then also do some thinking about the nature of their work. Do they use employees, or are they primarily a contractor-based organization? Not that we don't want to get all employers over time, but let's start where we can have some early wins and bring in employers to make the campaign robust, and then attract the harder to attract employers. So I would say focus on employers with head offices in your province, in your city, with the bulk of their employees in your province, and with the bulk of their workforce as employees. Also, because just for the purposes of relationship building, you want to be able to go and meet that employer face-to-face, so you'll want to know their head office is in a location that you can get to. Okay, so thinking some more about finding likely employers, because one of the questions that came in the early questions was, how could we convert Walmart? Well, frankly, we can't. That's going to be much later in this long campaign. Let's start with employers that have some identifiers that tell us that they are likely already doing some things that might make them likely candidates. So what awards have they achieved? Have they been picked as a top employer or a best employer to work? So do some scanning of the local business journal or the Globe and Mail business pages, or the local board of trade publications. Who is already being picked out by their peers? Not stuff that they're doing themselves, but they're being identified by their peers as being leading in their class. And also just think generally about local businesses that may not have the advantage of being big enough to be picked for one of these awards, but if you thought about the independent retailer that sells handmade furniture in your community, would you go, aha, I know that employer would be a great employer? So think about who's living in your community.
So before you approach an employer, you want to do a little bit of research. So it's always a good idea to have some background information on your employer before approaching them. And so the key here is that many good entrepreneurs really believe that they're doing work that solves a problem that exists in their communities. So it's important to see them as partners in your work and not adversaries. So we're in terms of our approach, part of building a partnership can be taking the time to be able to answer some really basic questions about that employer prior to meeting with them. And that can also help you go through the process of evaluating whether or not that employer is a good employer to bring into the campaign, or a good employer to approach for that initial conversation. So what is the size of the employer is one of the questions you should be asking. Is it small, medium, or large? Now, each sector has its own definition of what a large employer might be because of the size or kind of the makeup of that sector. Again, back to the decision makers. So where are the decision makers located? Is it a committee that will be making the decision? Is it a team? Is it an individual? Small employers tend to be quite nimble. when I work with small employers and approach them into the campaign, they can make a decision and their staff will get a raise the very next day. Large employers, because other decision makers need to be brought on board, it's a much slower process. What are the opportunities and challenges of that particular sector? Just having a basic understanding of some of, for example, profit margins that sector might be facing can help you know what are some of the challenges. So for example, when I approach credit unions, one of the challenges they face within their sector is differentiating themselves from the larger national financial institutions. So they're interested in ways that they can differentiate themselves from let's say, a Royal Bank or a Bank of Montreal. And the living wage is one really great way that they can differentiate themselves, but because they're placed in the community. What are the values of that company or organization? All companies have a set of values, and I know that for those of us coming from a nonprofit environment, sometimes that's hard to hear because we're so used to doing values-based work that we don't realize that folks who might be in for-profit or private companies also see themselves as doing values-based work. So it's important to understand that each kind of company has its own personality. What is the personality? You can answer these questions. Now, employers don't expect you to know everything, but I would suggest spending a half an hour to an hour on Google and just read through their website. And Google and see what news articles have been saying about them. And that will give you some good information. Now, the next thing that you want to cover when you come in to approach an employer is know the poverty context in your community. This is a slide I use when I'm presenting to employers, and I think it gives you a good idea of what some of the poverty context is for the particular community of Pitt Meadows, which is a suburb of Vancouver. Now, I'm lucky enough that I'm hosted by First Call BC, the Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition. They publish an annual report card. That annual report card provides information on where poverty is located in our community and what we can do about it. For those outside of BC, Campaign 2000 publishes similar information, or you might be part of an anti-poverty organization that you're working with, and you might have some of that information on hand from your own work. Employers care about poverty in our community. They see it, they live with it, they work with, some of them come from poverty. So let them know that the living wage is one way that they can partner with community groups to tackle poverty, that they have a role and they can take action. This is the slide I present to employers when I'm talking about the living wage. So you should have the infographic that I have on this slide in your handouts, but it basically lays out how we do the calculation and then how employers can come in and how we acknowledge or work through benefits with the living wage. And so that can answer some of the very basic employer questions. One of the most common questions is, do I have to pay my staff the living wage rate, or do you include benefits? So, and this helps explain how benefits are included. And also why we max out on benefits. For example, we often come into contact, because we're dealing with values-based employers, we often come into contact with employers who might be going above and beyond for their staff and including things like pensions that we don't use in our calculation. So it allows you to kind of congratulate the employer on that work, but explain to them why we don't recognize that as a benefit.
Okay, thanks, Deanna. So Deanna introduced this idea, and it's absolutely true. Most employers want to be great employers and do the right things. And as with any relationship with anybody, it will work best if you look for the positive attributes in a prospective employer, acknowledge those, and make room for the employer to move to your position about the importance of paying a living wage. This expression here on the slide that you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar is so true for the living wage campaign. You can help employers see it is in why their interests, the interests of their communities, and the interests of their employees for them to consider signing up as a living wage employer. let's go ahead one slide, Deanna. And so here are some quick stats around the business case for the living wage and discussions you can have with employers. We're going to go into a little more depth on a couple of these slides, and Deanna also has some great fact sheets up on the Living Wage for Families campaign. We just want to pause for a sec and do an audio check. Are we okay?
I think we're okay.
I think we're okay. Okay. So in the United Kingdom, where the Living Wage campaign has had more longevity than here in Canada, companies there are reporting a halving of turnover on the average. And for any employer, the cost of attraction, recruitment, and retention of employees is significant. And most employers won't say this out loud, but new employees aren't all that useful in the first couple of months you've hired. The investment you make in training them and bringing them up to speed on your processes, that's a sunk cost that you have in new employees, and then they start to pay a return on the investment you've made of them as an employee after a number of months. But if you're losing employees in those first couple of months as they churn in and out because you're not paying them a living wage or you're not paying them enough so that they don't have to hold down one or two jobs, that's a complete waste. And what UK firms that now pay a living wage have seen is their cost of attraction, retention, and recruitment have gone down 45 to 50% because those new employees stay. They stay through the startup and learning phase and become super productive plus happy employees. So it's absolutely worth the investment of paying them better. We're hearing the same thing out of Seattle now, where they've gone to a $15 minimum wage, are seeing the same kind of benefit. Other employers say they are seeing increased productivity and also an increase in work quality. So, by any employer's measure, you have happier workers doing better work with better returns, and you no longer have those lost costs of churn. Employers are also saying that consumer confidence increases when they are part of the Living Wage campaign, that 3/4 of the UK employers surveyed recently said they see a noticeable improvement in customer loyalty. This next slide here, that's a photo from Vancity's recertification back in 2013, and that woman in the red coat in the middle is Barbara Kaminsky, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Cancer Society. So this is something I want to talk to you about working with not-for-profit employers. And Barbara and her board, when they were considering becoming a living wage employer, had to have a conversation at the board level about whether or not their donors would think it was acceptable to pay the staff a living wage, that would that be taking money out of the actual work on cancer research. And Barbara and her board came to this position that the health outcomes for people living in poverty are so significantly worse than they are for people that have better incomes, that you can draw a direct link between poverty and cancer. So poverty actually is a carcinogen. And when they came to that statement, they said, this not-for-profit said, there's no way we cannot be a living wage employer, because we can't be the Canadian Cancer Society but be providing working conditions that promote poor health outcomes for our own employees. The fellow to the right of your slide in the pink shirt with the big grin, he's the owner of a small manufacturing company that produces little trophies and awards. I think he's only got 10 guys in his shop. And he was a very early entrant into the Living Wage for Family campaign, because it was his assertion, and remains his assertion, that happy workers just do awesome work. Again, back to the churn, much less churn, greater productivity, greater happiness in the workers, and the workers say better things about the company. When my credit union became a living wage employer, there was actually less than 2% of employees were actually impacted by the increase in wages. And that'll be the same for most credit unions across the country. But what it did for every single employee was increase their morale about working for this credit union. So all employees felt incredibly proud. And when your employees feel proud, it's just a better place to work. Now this slide, this is a screen snap from a local organization called LOCO BC, which is a chapter of the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And there are significant benefits to a local community when workers are paid enough to purchase in the local economy. Local businesses reinvest 2 to 4 times as much in the local economy as big box stores and create 3 times as many jobs. And so when we reinvest locally by paying a living wage, we get a living rate of what's known as a living rate of return in our local communities. So local investment by paying people a living wage so they can reinvest maximizes the percentage of people working in locally owned businesses, increases the local self-reliances of those businesses, and in turn the local production, local manufacturing, local farming. And we have also found that local businesses tend to set a higher standard for business practices. They can make decisions around greening their practices or reducing their carbon footprint or incorporating better governance practices at the board level, that all of that happens at the local level. And there is an American activist and economist named Michael Schuman. Many of you will be familiar with Michael Schuman. And he says that, in fact, the payment of the living wage is the single greatest thing that local communities can do to keep local communities strong. That, in fact, the living wage is to Walmart what kryptonite was to Superman. And that as a powerful tool to build strong local businesses, paying workers a living wage is one of the greatest. Now, this next slide, this is to tell a personal story about our own credit union, and it's we're a bigger credit union than most, and so it may seem a little bit out of scale, but there is a proportional factor that works for other credit unions or other employers. So when we were becoming a living wage employer, the bean counters were nervous. Oh, it's going to be expensive. It's going to be expensive. And our CEO, and it's really important to have leadership as an employer, to have your leadership say, just make it so. Our CEO put aside an amount of money for us to become compliant with the living wage. And as the slide shows, it cost us only $700,000 in that first year on an annual budget of $300 million. Well, for us, if I could do math on the fly, I would. But for us, that's a rounding area. It was less than 1% of our total operating budget that it took us to become compliant. And so, and that has been the universal experience of other employers. It was certainly the experience of the City of New Westminster, where it cost them 1/4% to become compliant, that many employers that are already good employers are close to paying the living wage. And in fact, this was an unintended consequence for us because we started to take instead of a combative adversarial approach with our own suppliers, working across the table from them, our purchasing team now sits shoulder to shoulder with those suppliers and talks about our procurement overall. And in fact, it has cleaned up our procurement, and now we're saving more each year than it cost us to implement the living wage, because the suppliers have been willing to have discussions with us about what we actually needed, instead of them trying to increase their margins by selling us stuff we didn't actually need. Now we're having principled conversations about the missions of ourselves and of those suppliers, and we didn't know this would happen, but we're actually saving money now. So that was not the intent, but that was the outcome. And if there's anyone on the phone that wants to talk more about this, or has an employer that wants to talk to us more about this, I'm always open to have employer-to-employer conversations.
Just to jump in here, I think this is really important, because often what we get from employers is fear. How much will it cost us to do this thing? What is the cost? And so to explain to them that the cost has been overwhelmingly less than anticipated, and just encourage them to run the numbers, and that, say you don't have to commit, but just look at what it would cost you. What we're not asking for is a commitment. What we're asking for you is to explore the idea. Often it comes in under what it is. And for me as an anti-poverty activist, this is both heartening and enraging. So it's heartening that we know that it's doable, it's achievable to pay people well. What's disheartening is how easy it is and how so few people do it. Yeah. So, and I think what we do want to encourage is it has been very low cost for employers to pay a living wage, and so it's important to emphasize that fact.
Thanks, Deanna. That's great. This next slide, I don't know if anyone recognizes him or has seen any of his TED Talks. Nick Hanauer, he's a gazillionaire out of Seattle, one of those ones that made bazillions in tech. And what's interesting about him is his access to elites and elite publications. I think this came out of Forbes magazine, and he is now talking. I mean, he's an unusual ally for sure as a gazillionaire, but kind of like Michael Schumann. Nick Hanauer's line is, you know, you can't have poorly paid workers and middle class consumers. That they're one and the same in a community. And so as an employer, if you're not paying your employees enough so that they can buy a local haircut, buy a pizza at the local pizza parlor, once in a while buy shoes at an independent shoe store, that really you're not setting up your community for success, and you're not setting up your own industries for success. Because if your industry doesn't have people that can afford to support it by buying its goods and services, you're setting up a community failure. And if anyone ever has time, it's worth watching his little 17-minute TED Talk called The Pitchforks Are Coming.
It's also important to understand that I found that Nick Hanauer is the one person who's most influential with our business owners. And so it's important to understand that some of the media that we access or read is not necessarily the media that our employers are accessing, but they are accessing Nick Hanauer. So it's the first question I get asked often when I go to a talk is, oh, have you seen the Nick Hanauer TED Talk? So it's a good idea to do it. So the next thing you want to do is we want to find a warm point of entry. Now, I have jokingly referred to my job as an organizer as in some way somewhat sanctioned following people around and finding people. And that's actually really what we want to do. So we want to find a warm point of entry, whether that is finding somebody who knows someone who's willing to do an email introduction or send an email out, or find out where that person hangs out and just happen to bump into them. Sometimes going to events can be really helpful for that. And I think for those of you who are in smaller communities, I think you're really in a good space here, and I'm a bit envious of you because it's easier to bump into people in a smaller community than it might be here in Vancouver. So, you know, bump into somebody and kind of just have a chat. You know, one of the first things we often say when we chat is, what are you up to right now? And so be prepared to say, you know, I'm working with a living wage, or I'm an employer whom we just certified as a living wage employer, and the response that we've received has been fabulous. I would love to talk to you about that sometime, or just along those lines. The next thing that you want to do is ask for a face-to-face meeting, because that is often the best space to have a real conversation on the living wage. So send an email asking to come for a visit. I will always offer to go to the employer. I never request that they come to me. I go to them. And if they say, no, it's okay on the by phone, I say, no, I really would love to see your offices. I really want to see where you work. For me, that's really important, and it establishes an in-person connection. I don't know where that came from. And promise that this is exploratory only. They're not making a commitment. So we're not exchanging marriage vows. We're not saying that just because you talk to me, you have to become a living wage employer. And part of that is the only vow I take is a vow of confidentiality. I say, your initial conversations with me are confidential and always will be confidential until you're comfortable sharing. And so I don't tell anyone, oh, guess who just called me today, this organization. They're interested. Because often what we're talking about is we're talking about people's wages. And that is deeply, deeply important to them. And we're talking about people's businesses. Again, something that's really, really important to them. So it's their story to share. Just as much as when we're doing direct service, we respect confidentiality and respect each individual's experiences and ability to decide when and how to share their own story. We do the same for employers. And part of that is being able to leave the door open for further conversations. That's basically what you're creating, is that we know that employers rarely make the decision to sign on in the first meeting, so we want to be able to have multiple conversations. We also want to acknowledge the work that the employer is engaged in. We now know, based on our internet research, what kind of activities they do, and we want to make sure that we're building a partnership, because we want engaged employers. We want employers who are able to talk about poverty in the community and talk about what they do to address that. That's the unique role of the Living Wage for Families campaign, and that's what we can offer. So we want to prepare for that meeting. So think about what the employer is, and then dress appropriately and act appropriately when you go to the office. You know, most of us coming from nonprofits probably have one set of what we call our business clothes. Mine gets a lot of wear because if I'm going to a place where it's more formal, I'm going to dress a bit more formal for that meeting. But if it's a place that's very informal, I'm going to dress a little bit more informal as well. And just in the same way that we do that when we're working with folks in direct service, we don't want our appearance to be a barrier to establishing a relationship. And so the other thing we want to do is we want to see, oh, were they in the news lately, any kind of ups or downs. We want to kind of confirm the meeting the day before, reminding that we'll be at their office, and then confirm the amount of time that we have with them. And then we want to bring kind of what I casually refer to as propaganda. We want to bring fact sheets from our websites or fact sheets that we've established. We also want to make sure that we're bringing information that they can take away with them on the process. So we have an employer's guide that we give all of our employers. Even if I know they've already printed it out, I'll bring a few copies. Okay, so again, at the meeting, and this is really important, don't say why we're there. So I'll say, you know, my name is Deanna Ogle, and if they ask me why, I'll say,
at reception, you mean?
Yeah, at the reception, often you have to give your name. I won't necessarily say the organization I'm with. I kind of, you know, you don't want to stride in and say, I'm going to make sure you guys pay a living wage. Because again, what we're talking about is folks' wages, and so we don't want to set up false expectations on the part of staff, because we don't know how long it will take the business to move forward. So we don't want staff to think, oh, they're going to do that next week, when in fact the process and budgeting might take a bit longer. So it's both, I think, a part of respect to the employer, but also respect to the staff person around making sure that they don't have unrealistic expectations of what their employer is going to do. We don't want to sour that relationship inadvertently. So at the meeting, we want to start with thanks. We want to ask what they already know. We want to, about the living wage, basically open it up and just say, what have you heard? What do you know? And what are you interested in it? How did you hear about us? So I often kind of start by kind of celebrating the fact that they're interested in it. And they get excited about that too, right? So it's about kind of celebrating that excitement, and we use that to kind of close the deal. So it very much is kind of a sales pitch. So at the meeting, so it's important to kind of do a bit of small talk just to kind of break down things. So whether that's like, hey, how are you doing? Or, you know, for folks, I'm from the prairie, so some of the prairie folks on the line will know that the first thing that we do is talk about the weather for about 10 minutes. And then we get into crops. But for other folks, there is something, you know, each community has its own kind of small talk and its own culture around what you do when you come in. But the first thing you want to confirm the length of the time, say, this meeting is set for 45 minutes, does that still work for you? You want to ask permission to take notes, to say, I'm going to take notes just as a reminder of what I'm going to do and what I'm committing to. And then do they ask? We want you to sign on to be a living wage employer. We think it's a really exciting idea, and we think it fits well with your values. We think it's a real values match between you your company because of these things that you do and the living wage. So to kind of identify that the living wage is a values match with the company can sometimes be really, really helpful, even more than the business case. Because if it's a values match, they already know the business case for being an ethical employer. So we don't have to prove it. So it allows us to kind of step back and really get into the nuts and bolts. And so match it to some of the work that they do, whether that's on environmental sustainability or anti-poverty. So, and part of that is acknowledging the work that they're already doing. So do they try and stock fair trade items? Is that a conscious decision? Are they very active in trying to push forward progressive ideas within the local board of trade? Are they members of a B Corp? Are they a B Corp member? Do they really pride themselves on their environmental sustainability programs? All this stuff that you can find on their website, because employers really are proud of that work, and so they share it on their website. They tend to not be very secretive about the work that they do. At the meeting, you want to make sure that you're answering concerns fully and truthfully, but you also don't want to provide false information or information that you're not sure about. So if you don't know the answer, it's totally fine to say, you know what, I'm going to look into that and get back to you. Often what I'll say is, you know what, we're a really new campaign. This is what I've learned from Catherine. We're a really new campaign, and each employer brings their own kind of unique perspective and questions to us, and you know what you brought is really unique. So I'm going to have to go back and look into it, and I'll follow up with you. And that provides you actually with a link to follow up. So it's a really great way to maintain that relationship. So don't feel like you have to have all the answers, because sometimes it's better to have a question that you have to follow up on. Ask for their permission to introduce them to a current living wage employer. If you are a current living wage employer, and I know there's a few on the line, even better, you just introduce them to one. You can talk about what that meant for you and how it's benefited your company or your organization. And some of the unintended benefits, what you didn't see coming that came up, are really important. I think that kind of surprising information is what we all learn from the campaign, including potential employers.
And Deanna, can I add in here on this last one? If you're a living wage campaigner and you're meeting with an employer and you offer to introduce them to another employer, your value as a living wage campaigner goes way up in my mind as an employer. Suddenly you're a broker of relationships, and I trust that you know what you're doing even more. So it also has the benefit of improving your credibility to me as an employer if you offer to make that introduction.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, there you go.
Okay. Okay. We want to be genuinely appreciative of everything of them taking the meeting, even if it wasn't an entirely positive meeting. So, you know what, especially if it wasn't an entirely positive meeting. You know, part of it is, you know, we want to make sure that we are taking that lemon and making lemonade. And so even if if they initially say no, it might turn into a yes later. So listen to why they're saying no, because there might be opportunities for you moving forward. So, you know, and it all depends, right? The no doesn't necessarily mean no forever, I hate you, get away from me. A no can mean we're close to bargaining and we're not quite sure if we're doing it. No might mean, you know what, we need a few years of budgeting to get there, but we would like to, so give us some time. No might mean, oh, that's a really complicated idea. I think I need to talk to other people about it first, and then get back to you. So make sure you leave that door open, because some of that information they may not be able to disclose to you. Yeah, so, right. So you know, sometimes a no isn't about us.
And this is just, you know, basic, to go back to the beginning, basic etiquette, just as you would do with a job interview. Send a thank you note right away, certainly within 24 hours, but even better before you go to bed that night. Answer any questions that came up that you weren't able to answer in the meeting, and then try to add something of value into this thank you note. Go to the Living Wage for Families campaign website or your local campaign website. put in a link or attach an article or send the link to the Nick Hanauer TED Talk, but introduce something else of value into that email, and then tell them that you're going to keep in touch. And then link them to those other employers. In a month or so, get back to them, sending up a following email, asking if they have any other questions that they want to ask you about, or whether they'd now like you to come back for a meeting with some other leaders within their organization. But like everything, follow-up is critical here. So keep offering to be of value to them and to answer their questions.
And sometimes that follow-up might just be offering to present to them on the issue, or present to other people in their company on the issue. So following up doesn't always have to be this kind of magical step forward. Often it's just kind of maintaining an open door, or maintaining an ongoing relationship. I have some employers who have been maintaining an ongoing relationship for now for a year and a half.
Yeah, me too as an employer, Deanna. I've been talking with senior planning staff in a number of municipalities for a couple of years now. And part of the follow-up is linking my procurement person to their procurement person, and then linking my HR person to their HR person. But I'm keep trying to move along what I hope are eventual yeses. They can, and this goes back to deciding which employers you're going to go out. When you're working on public campaigns, which have complicated decision makers at the top of the process, you may be looking at a multi-year commitment to get them to a yes. But the value you provide, either as a living wage activist or as an embedded activist in another employer, keep trying to bring new value to the conversations to move them towards the eventual yes.
Mm-hmm. So, I think, and why I say this is because, I think from an external perspective, a lot of times folks just say, oh my gosh, you guys just announced another employer. How do you do all that? Well, we do all that very, very, very slowly. So, part of that is communicating to our own advisory committees or boards about the pace of change, which is slow. It's not as fast as we want it to be. There are some employers, of course, who can come on board very quickly, but the employers who are going to make a real impact are going to take longer. So just to be patient with that process. And so part of the patience is just maintaining a really good working relationship and checking in every little once in a while. And that, and what I do is I set reminders on my Outlook that, every few months I have to send this email to this person, just as a reminder, just to kind of keep that contact going, and not in a way that's aggressive or creepy. Like, it can often just be like 1 or 2 lines, just like, hey, checking in, or hey, I saw you were in the news, or I heard that you introduced a new program. It looks fabulous. Just, and so just kind of maintain that door, or keep it open. If you're in a small community, you maybe don't have to send the email. You can just bump into them. Yeah. Just one more bump in, and then you can just remind them that you're there, or that, you're still interested, or you're still doing this thing. And that can be really, really helpful. So now we come to that time where we actually hear from you about some of the work that you're engaged in. So either through questions or through chat, or I guess through that raising your hand. Let us know if you have any particular questions, and we'd love to open the conversation up into a richer dialogue. Okay, while we're waiting maybe for questions to come in, or folks to come back to us with questions, maybe we'll talk through some of what we see as common pushback that we get from employers. So I usually separate it into two areas. So there's pushback. There's pushback coming from employers based on not being on board with the central idea of the living wage. And there's pushback from employers about not understanding how they go through the process of implementation. And how we respond to each question is very different based on that idea of are they having trouble with the concept, or are they having trouble with the implementation?
In my experience, it's the implementation where employers get a little panicked at first. And when I have the opportunity to speak to employers, I'm careful to separate it into two bunches of work, two important and related bunches of work. But first of all is understanding how close you already may be as an employer with your employees. And I introduce them to the calculator, and I often ask them on a confidential basis to share with me, employer to employer, what their lowest paid worker makes, and then I work on the calculator with them directly, shoulder to shoulder, or sharing screens so that we can see how close they are. I say, in fact, that is the easiest part for employers to do. The tough part for any employer, and I always say, and I want to be realistic about this so you know what you're getting into, is understanding the scope of contracted labor that you have providing services to your business. And so let's start by looking at a printout from your financials about where are you buying labor supports. Because working with contracted labor supports is in fact where the real lift in the campaign is, because that's when we get at the low wage workers that are in security or janitorial or landscaping or any of those things that may not be our primary business, but which we contract for as part of our whole bundle of services. And so helping employers understand there's first the employees, but then the contracted labor, and then having a good conversation with them about what kinds of contracted labor, how are you going to test how much of this labor pool you can negotiate with your suppliers to become living wage employers, how much of it is within your control, so how much of it is located in your province, is the subcontractor located in your province, all those questions, and that's a really meaty conversation with another employer. My job as a living wage activist talking to those folks is to try and demystify that. And I tell them that that's where the work is, but it's absolutely not impossible to do. And once you start to break it down, it's just really just kind of take a step-by-step approach to marching through those contracted labor supports. To set a realistic time frame for medium and large size employers, this is not something that's going to happen today. You know, Deanna and I just had the great fortune of seeing last week two small employers, both around the 10 to 15 employer size, apply to be living wage employers, and they made a decision in the minute that Deanna talked about to start paying their employees the living wage. That was easy. But when you're working with medium and larger employers, to help them set a realistic time frame, but remind them that other medium and large employers have done this, and we're here to help.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question from Graham, and then I see a question from Valerie. So I'm going to get to the question from Graham, and then Valerie, we're going to come to you. Graham asked that he's interested in the intersection or differentiation between a living wage provided independently by an employer and a living wage mandated by a municipal, provincial, federal government. So often what we see when we're talking about living wages, Graham, is when we get a municipality to sign on as a living wage employer, they're signing on in their role as an employer. So they're looking at both their direct and contract services and bringing those on board, direct staff and contract staff, and bringing those on board to a living wage. This is not like some of the living wage ordinances in the United States where a municipality has the power to set a wage rate for that municipality or that county. We don't have that opportunity or legislation available to us in Canada. So the only opportunity for a municipality is to sign on to be a living wage employer and to deal with its ability to influence and to pay their direct and contract staff a living wage. Now they're an influencer. So when we think about getting a municipality on board, we know that we're getting an employer who talks to a lot of other employers. And so if we get an engaged municipality, they have a lot of power to bring on other employers. And so that's where we often target municipalities, one, both because they have a lot of staff and they have substantial procurement contracts, but also because they have the potential to influence other employers in their community and their region. Private employers may or may not do that. Private employers who are service-based, such as financial services, are an employer who also talk to a lot of other employers. And so they're a good target. Other employers who may not necessarily, so look at who are influencers and who are doing well when you're looking at who are good employers to bring on board.
And Deanna, if I can just add here, Graham, the point that you raised here, and Deanna gave a brilliant answer. This also, when you're out doing general campaigning work, it's very important to make this distinction about the authority in the United States for living wage ordinances at a municipal level and the fact that we don't do that in Canada, because we often see people run for the hills in fear, the general public as well, when we start talking about working at a local level for a municipal wage. The assumption is that it will mandate all businesses within a municipality to suddenly be paying the living wage. Then people have moved to a fear place, and it's hard to listen when you're in a fear place. So drawing that distinction that when we're doing municipal work in Canada, it's only about the municipality itself and not about businesses within the municipality being required to pay a living wage. Of course, they all should pay a living wage and be great for them to get there over time, but making that distinction between the United States and Canada is really important.
Okay, Valerie, I'm going to unmute you here if you want to ask your question. So I see that you've typed it in, but did you want to ask it?
Sure. What I've heard from some employers is that by raising the lowest wages within the wage grid, they also have to raise wages throughout the entire grid to maintain the hierarchical structure. How do you answer questions regarding that?
Thank you for that question, Valerie. That's something we hear a lot.
Or what can you suggest to employers who are concerned about maintaining that?
Catherine is kind of jumping in her seat right now, so I'm going to let her answer that question.
So I love it, Valerie, as an employer. I love it when folks ask me that, whether they're the employer or the labor unions or other folks. This is not a bargaining strategy. This is a poverty reduction strategy. And so when folks say to us, oh, what if there's compression at the bottom? Don't we have to raise them all? We say, no, absolutely not. This is about addressing the lowest paid workers in your workforce because you care about them, because workers that work for you should make enough to get by in the work they do. This is not a negotiating strategy. It's not a bargaining strategy. Let's think back to our roots as labor activist people. This is a poverty reduction strategy.
Yeah. And so often what I say is and I encourage employers to have an internal communication strategy in place for when they raise or include the living wage. So part of that is about communicating to the staff exactly why they're implementing a living wage. So when you communicate to your staff that we're doing this because we want all of our staff to be able to make ends meet in their particular community, including, sometimes, Jane is working beside Bob every day. Bob makes 50 cents more an hour than Jane and has 50 cents more an hour worth of authority. Now, you implement a living wage, and Jane all of a sudden is going to be making the same wage as Bob. But if we tell Bob, Jane is making that wage now because so that Jane can make ends meet in her community, Bob has heard all about Jane's struggles more than likely because he sits beside her every day. He knows that she really struggles paying her child care, or that she, has to borrow money from her mom because he heard her talk about it in the cubicle or heard her talk about it at the desk. So, having that communication strategy, we're doing this so that we can all make our ends meet in a particular community. It can help communicate the value of the living wage and why we're doing it. So it's about making sure that employers understand that that's their job. That's not my job as an organizer. That's their job as an employer to communicate that. And if they choose to increase Bob's wage, that's their choice. But what I need them to do is to increase Jane's wage so that she can pay her child care bill.
Yeah. The raising of the question in the worksite actually leads to the very richest conversations about being a caring employer and being a caring community.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, so the next question here is from Kendall. And so Kendall asked, how do you respond to employers who argue that younger employees who live at home should not earn a living wage? So that's a really great question, Kendall. And that's a really common one, is that So the living wage for families, we have an exemption for student positions, but we don't exempt positions that happen to be filled by students. Because maybe it happens to be filled by students because it's precarious, low-pay position. But what I do is I often talk about, and this is maybe where, you know, coming from a family that was low income is handy. Where I'll talk about my own experiences, that when I worked as a youth and I had a very active and engaged babysitting company as well as other jobs, what I was doing was relieving the financial pressure from my family. So although I was buying t-shirts, I was buying my school supplies, I was buying, I was having money so that I could go to a movie after school. Middle income families and higher income families didn't need their children to work so that they could go to a movie. So I was supplementing my family income, even though we don't necessarily frame it in that way.
And the reason, the distinction that Deanna drew at the beginning, some employers will have additional work in the summer that are for high school students that are summer jobs. If that work is additional to the core work, that's where the policy around still certifying employers that might employ students at a student rate does allow for that. What we don't want is employers arguing that the value of the work or the value of the workers should be somehow less, and then they start to job out core activities of their business to students because they want to pay students less money. It also, there's the question of who are we to know or judge, as Deanna just shared from her personal experience, what the situation is of a younger worker. They may be, in fact, supporting the family, as Deanna was. They may actually be a head income earner. They may be transiting out of the foster care system. They may be supporting a sister with Down syndrome. And for all kinds of human rights questions, it's not for us to ask about the makeup of the family and then make determinations about what income should come into the family.
Okay. So that takes us to 11 o'clock, actually. So we're done the webinar. So again, as I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out an evaluation tomorrow. We encourage you to participate in that evaluation and let us know what other topics you would like us to do. Let us know if there's other topics that we can answer. Do you have questions about how to build a municipal campaign? Do you have questions about procurement and how procurement works with the living wage? We're really looking forward to taking advantage of actually understanding how to use this technology, which we're still learning, but to bring you more information on this topic and to share what we're learning, but also maybe you have a particular skill or a particular learning that you have in your community. Do you want to host a webinar? I'd love to work with you to do that. So share an idea maybe that you have that you can deliver, and we'll arrange that as well. Let's work together and kind of share our skills and our knowledge with each other as much as possible. So thanks everyone. So Catherine?
Thanks everyone. Thanks Deanna. Thanks for the great questions.
So, and again, reach out to us individually if you have questions that we didn't answer or if you have a particular employer. Thank you so much. We look forward to chatting with you.